The Giza Power Plant, a tomb that doesn't behave like one. Picture this. A tourist stands in the desert, squinting into the sun, staring up at the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's enormous. Silent. Impossibly still after 4,500 years. A guide clears their throat and says, confidently, "This is a tomb." Everyone nods, because that's what we've been told. Because that's what the sign says. Because that's what we repeat to each other until it feels settled, and then the group moves on. No one asks why this tomb has no body. No one asks why there are no inscriptions, no spells, no prayers, no warnings to grave robbers, no hymns to the afterlife. No one asks why there are no wall paintings, no reliefs, no stories carved into stone the way Egyptians always did. No one asks why there are no grave goods, no furniture, no jewelry, no food, no ritual clutter. No one asks why the internal chambers feel less like rooms and more like components. If this is a tomb, it's a very strange one. If this is a tomb, it's the quietest, cleanest, most over-engineered tomb ever built. Now pause for a second, because this is where the mismatch starts to itch. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife. They embalmed bodies with almost scientific care. They filled tombs with text, endless text, detailing how to navigate the next world. They painted walls with scenes of judgment, rebirth, and eternal order. Even modest tombs are crowded with meaning. And yet the largest, most precise, most famous structure they ever built contains nothing. No mummy has ever been found inside the Great Pyramid. Not lost, not stolen, not hidden in some undiscovered niche. None. Ever. This isn't controversial. It's just quietly inconvenient. Contrast that with other Egyptian tombs. The Valley of the Kings is packed with inscriptions. Walls covered floor to ceiling with spells, maps of the underworld, instructions for the soul. Even unfinished tombs have decoration. The Great Pyramid has none. It's bare, sterile, almost indifferent to symbolism. I know what you're thinking. Maybe it was looted. Maybe time erased the evidence. Maybe we just haven't found everything yet. Those explanations work, until you realize something important. Looters don't remove wall texts. Time doesn't selectively erase every trace of funerary purpose. And archaeologists have been crawling through this structure for centuries. This isn't absence by accident. It's absence by design. So let's ask the question slowly, without drama. Why would a civilization that poured its soul into preparing for death build its most important tomb and leave it empty? Why would they abandon everything they believed about burial practices for this one structure, and only this one? Why does the Great Pyramid behave unlike any tomb before it, or after it? This is where the bedtime story tone comes back. Imagine you're a child and someone hands you a box and says, "This is a music box," but when you open it, there's no melody, no mechanism, no place for sound. At some point, the child asks the obvious question, "Are you sure this is what you say it is?" That's all we're doing here. We're not declaring what the Great Pyramid was. We're just noticing what it isn't. And once you allow yourself to feel that mismatch, once you stop nodding automatically, the Great Pyramid stops feeling like a monument to death, and starts feeling like a machine that was never meant to hold a body at all. A structure that refuses to act symbolic. Before we decide what the Great Pyramid meant, we need to slow down and look at what it actually is. Not what we assume it is. Not what we've been told it represents. Just the object itself. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2560 BCE. That date alone should already give us pause. This isn't late Egyptian civilization drawing on centuries of accumulated architectural wisdom. This is early, shockingly early, for something so refined. It's made of roughly 2.3 million stone blocks. Not bricks. Not rubble. Precision-cut limestone and granite blocks, each weighing anywhere from 2 tons to more than 80 tons. Some of the heaviest stones, used deep inside the structure, were transported hundreds of kilometers from Aswan, and they weren't stacked casually. The pyramid is aligned to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, with an accuracy of about 0.05 degrees. That's not close enough. That's obsessive. Modern skyscrapers don't bother being this exact. And remember, this was done without compasses, GPS, lasers, or steel tools. Whatever method was used, it wasn't guesswork. Now let's step inside. The internal layout of the Great Pyramid is surprisingly simple and deeply strange. There's the king's chamber, constructed entirely of granite with a stone box often called a sarcophagus. No lid, No decoration. No inscriptions. There's the Queen's Chamber, which, despite the name, shows no evidence of ever housing a queen. Or anyone. Connecting them is the Grand Gallery, a soaring, narrow corridor with a corbelled ceiling that rises over 8 meters high. It's dramatic, purposeful, almost theatrical, but not symbolic. There are no hieroglyphs anywhere inside, no prayers, no spells, no instructions for the soul. This alone should make us uncomfortable. Egyptian tombs are loud with meaning. Walls speak. Ceilings tell stories. Even modest burial sites overflow with text designed to guide the dead through the afterlife. The Great Pyramid says nothing. Then there are the shafts. Small, narrow channels extend from both the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber. For a long time they were called air shafts. But here's the thing. They don't function like ventilation. They're too narrow to crawl through. They don't meet in the middle. Some of them don't even reach the outside. One of them ends behind a stone door with copper handles. Handles that serve no mechanical purpose. This isn't airflow. It's alignment, orientation, pointing. And this is where the structure starts to feel less like architecture and more like a sealed device. Everything inside the pyramid is hidden. Everything is enclosed. Everything is intentional. There are no hallways for visitors. No chambers designed for ritual gatherings. No visual storytelling. Just stone, geometry, passageways that seem more concerned with precision than ceremony. Ask yourself, gently, honestly, why does a tomb look more like a closed system? Why does it prioritize alignment over imagery? Accuracy over symbolism? Structure over story? Here's another detail that's easy to overlook. The Great Pyramid wasn't part of a gradual learning curve. Earlier pyramids exist, but they wobble, they collapse, they fail. They experiment. The Great Pyramid doesn't look experimental. It looks confident, and what comes after it? Smaller pyramids. Less precise, less ambitious. It's as if the pinnacle comes first, and everything afterward is imitation. That's not how trial and error usually works. This isn't the story of humans slowly learning how to build bigger and better. It's the story of humans executing something extremely demanding very early, and then never quite doing it again the same way. Now, none of this proves the pyramid wasn't a tomb. But it does force us to admit something quietly important. If it was a tomb, it ignores almost every cultural rule the Egyptians followed about tombs. No decoration, no text, no body. What it does follow, perfectly, is a different set of priorities. Geometry, alignment, internal resonance. Material choice. Granite, in particular, is interesting. It's hard, difficult to work. And this matters, it has piezoelectric properties. Under pressure, it can generate electrical charge. Was that known to the Egyptians? We're not answering that yet. We're just noticing that the materials and layout don't feel accidental. At some point, the honest question shifts. Not to, was this a tomb? But to something more curious and more childlike. Why does this thing care so much about precision? And so little about death? And once that question settles in your mind, the Great Pyramid stops being a silent monument. It becomes a riddle. One that doesn't speak in symbols. One that waits patiently for us to stop, assuming we already know what it was for. Maybe we just lost the decorations? Alright, this is where the sensible explanation steps in, hands in pockets, trying to calm everyone down. Maybe the Great Pyramid was decorated. Maybe it was full of ritual objects. Maybe time, theft, and decay simply erased the evidence. That's a fair instinct. Grave robbers existed. Time is brutal. History is messy. So let's grant all of that up front. But then we have to ask, calmly, without drama, what robbers actually do. Robbers steal objects. They take gold. They take jewelry. They take portable valuables. They don't chisel away entire wall systems. They don't carefully erase inscriptions from every surface. They don't remove relief carvings carved into solid stone. They don't scrape away symbolism that's part of the architecture itself. And time? Time weathers surfaces. It collapses ceilings. It erodes edges. It doesn't selectively delete meaning. Here's the part that complicates the easy answer. Other Egyptian pyramids were robbed too, many of them. And yet, they still contain inscriptions. They still have painted reliefs. They still carry funerary texts, sometimes added centuries later, but present nonetheless. Even damaged, looted, or unfinished tombs tell us what they were meant for. The Great Pyramid does not. Not because it's empty now, because it was designed to be empty. Now you might be thinking, okay, but absence isn't evidence. True, absence alone doesn't prove anything. But consistent absence across every chamber, passageway, and surface starts to say something, especially when that absence aligns with something else. What is present? This is the key shift. We stop asking, what's missing, and start asking, what's here and why? What's here is precision. What's here is alignment. What's here is internal geometry that serves no obvious symbolic purpose. What's here are materials chosen not for beauty, but for properties. Granite, limestone. Different densities. Different responses to stress and vibration. What's here are chambers positioned with intent. Shafts aimed with care. Passageways that feel designed for flow, not procession. And what's most telling of all, what's here doesn't change. Egyptian religious art evolved over time. Symbols shifted. Texts were added, beliefs adapted. The Great Pyramid didn't get updated. No new carvings. No added inscriptions. No retroactive explanations. It remained sealed, untouched, silent. That's unusual. If this structure were a tomb, later generations would have enhanced it, decorated it, claimed it, inscribed their theology onto its walls. They didn't. It's as if the pyramid wasn't theirs to modify. As if its purpose wasn't symbolic, so adding symbolism would have been inappropriate. Or pointless. At this point, we don't need to propose an alternative explanation yet. We just need to be honest about the mismatch. A civilization obsessed with recording the afterlife built its most ambitious structure and left it textless. A culture that believed words had power chose silence. That doesn't mean we know what the pyramid was for. But it does mean the question, maybe we just lost the decorations, doesn't carry as much weight as we'd like it to. Because when a pattern holds across centuries of looting, weather, and reuse, it stops feeling like an accident and starts feeling like a design choice. So let's hold on to that shift. Not what's missing, but what remains stubbornly, deliberately present. Because whatever the Great Pyramid was built to do, it wasn't built to tell a story. It was built to function. And that changes everything that comes next. This isn't art. It's calibration. This is the moment where the Great Pyramid stops, pretending to be mysterious, and starts being awkward, because symbolism is flexible. Engineering is not. You can interpret art 100 ways. You can't accidentally align millions of tons of stone to mathematical constants and planetary measurements, and then shrug it off as decorative enthusiasm. So let's talk about the numbers. Not mystically. Not breathlessly. Just plainly, start with pi. If you take the perimeter of the Great Pyramid and compare it to its height, something strange happens. The ratio closely matches the circumference of a circle whose radius equals the pyramid's height. In simple terms, the pyramid encodes a circle. That's not an abstract spiritual metaphor. That's geometry. You don't get this by eyeballing stone blocks. You get it by planning. By deciding in advance that a specific relationship between height and perimeter matters. Now move to phi, the golden ratio. The proportions of the internal chambers, especially the king's chamber, and the grand gallery, fall into relationships that mirror the golden ratio. This ratio shows up in nature, yes, but it also shows up where optimization matters. Stability, resonance, efficient distribution. Artists use phi for beauty. Engineers use it for balance. And here's the uncomfortable part. There's no reason a tomb needs this. A coffin doesn't care about harmonic ratios. A soul doesn't need architectural optimization. But a system designed to behave predictably under stress, vibration, or load. That absolutely does. Now let's zoom out, way out. The scale of the Great Pyramid, when adjusted, mirrors dimensions of the Earth with surprising accuracy. The relationship between its height and the planet's radius isn't exact, but it's close enough to raise eyebrows. Close enough that coincidence starts to feel lazy. I know what you're thinking. Ancient people liked numbers. They liked symbolism. Sure, but here's the key question we keep bumping into. Why would the Egyptians care this much about numbers they didn't need yet? They didn't need planetary scale measurements to bury a king. They didn't need harmonic geometry to prepare a soul. So why is it all there? Now let's talk about the shafts. The Queen's chamber has 2 narrow shafts. They were long assumed to be ventilation channels until people realized they don't ventilate anything. They're sealed. One ends behind a limestone block fitted with copper handles that don't open anything. Another stops short of the outside world. And their alignment? They point very deliberately toward specific stars that were important in ancient Egyptian cosmology. not vaguely upward. Not generally celestial. Precisely. Ask the question slowly. Why would a tomb need directional sealed channels aimed at the sky? Not to let air in, not to let people out, but to connect something inside with something outside. Orientation matters here. Now let's talk materials. The king's chamber is built entirely of granite. Granite is a nightmare to work with. It's hard, dense, unforgiving, and it's full of quartz. Quartz has a property called piezoelectricity. When you apply pressure or vibration to it, it generates an electrical charge. Did the Egyptians know this in modern scientific terms? Probably not. But they didn't need the equation to notice the effect. You don't need to know Maxwell's laws to feel a shock. Now wrap that granite chamber in layers of limestone, or rather, remember that the pyramid was once encased in smooth white limestone. Limestone is an excellent insulator, so what do we have? A conductive chamber inside an insulating shell, built with obsessive geometric precision, aligned to the earth and the stars, with channels that seem designed to direct something invisible. My translation: if you were accidentally building a machine that interacts with vibration and energy, this is exactly how you do it. Accidentally is doing a lot of work there. Now, before your brain jumps too far ahead, let's be clear. No one is claiming the Great Pyramid powered ancient light bulbs or charged flying craft. That's not where this is going. This is about behavior. Structures behave in certain ways. Tombs behave like containers for meaning. Machines behave like systems designed to manage forces. The Great Pyramid behaves like the second one. It prioritizes precision over decoration, alignment over storytelling, material properties over symbolism. And it does this consistently. That's the part that refuses to be brushed away. You can argue one feature is symbolic. You can argue two are coincidence. But when geometry, material science, astronomy, and scale all point in the same direction, at some point you have to stop saying, "Isn't it interesting?" and start asking, what problem was this structure solving? Because whatever the answer is, it wasn't spiritual comfort. It was something colder, more technical, more deliberate. The Great Pyramid doesn't feel like a prayer. It feels like calibration, as if it was built to tune something, align something, stabilize something. And once you let yourself see it that way, even briefly, the idea that this was just a tomb starts to feel less like tradition and more like a story we tell ourselves, because the alternative asks too much of us. Not belief, but humility. Because admitting this structure may have had a purpose we no longer understand means admitting there are chapters of human capability we don't remember writing. And that's a harder thing to bury than any king. A machine that hums. Let's tread carefully here. Not because the idea is fragile, but because it's easy to turn something subtle into something silly if we rush it. The phrase power plant tends to trigger images of cables, turbines, or glowing beams shooting into the sky. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about behavior. Because one thing about the Great Pyramid is no longer up for debate: it responds. Researchers have tested this, not with mysticism, but with instruments. Acoustic experiments show that the pyramid resonates at specific frequencies. When sound waves enter the structure, certain chambers amplify them. Not randomly. Not equally. The king's chamber, in particular, behaves like a resonant cavity. Sound waves bounce, reinforce, and stabilize in predictable patterns. The geometry funnels vibration in ways engineers would recognize instantly. This isn't speculation. These are measurable effects. The internal passages act like waveguides, structures designed to direct energy, sound, or waves along controlled paths. The Grand Gallery doesn't just look dramatic. Its shape encourages reflection, focus, and movement of vibration. The pyramid doesn't just sit there, it responds. Now, does that mean the Egyptians built it to hum? We don't know. But here's the key shift we have to allow ourselves. A structure that resonates predictably isn't a passive monument. It's a system. And systems usually have functions, even if we've forgotten what they are. So let's explore possibilities, carefully without declaring winners. One possibility is energy harmonization. Not energy in the mystical sense, but physical vibration. The Earth itself hums with low-frequency oscillations. The planet is not silent. It's constantly moving, flexing, ringing. A structure precisely aligned, deeply grounded, and geometrically tuned could interact with those oscillations, stabilizing, amplifying, or modulating them. Another possibility is signal amplification. Ancient cultures were obsessed with the sky. Not romantically, practically. Timekeeping, navigation, agriculture. A structure aligned to stars, built to resonate, and equipped with directional shafts could have served as a kind of amplifier, not transmitting messages, but synchronizing cycles. Think less radio tower and more tuning fork. Then there's the most uncomfortable possibility, consciousness interaction. This one makes people squirm, so let's frame it gently. Human consciousness is affected by sound, rhythm, and environment. Chanting, drumming, architecture, these have measurable psychological and neurological effects. A resonant chamber designed to focus vibration could alter perception, awareness, or mental state. Not magic. Physiology. And finally, there's the idea of Earth grid resonance. Across the globe, ancient structures appear at specific locations, often aligned, often precise, often built on geologically active sites. The Great Pyramid sits where the Earth's crust, water tables, and seismic features converge in complex ways. Could it have been designed to interact with that? We don't know. And that's the point. The hypothesis isn't that the Great Pyramid powered something we can easily name. The hypothesis is simpler and more difficult to ignore. Whatever it did, it wasn't passive. Tombs don't need to resonate. Burial chambers don't need waveguides. Graves don't need calibration. But machines do. Even machines whose purpose we no longer recognize. So when people hear power plant and laugh, they're reacting to imagery, not evidence. Strip away the label. Look at the behavior, look at the measurements, look at the consistency, and ask a much smaller, much safer question. Why does a structure supposedly built for death behave like something designed to interact with the living world? We don't have to know the answer yet. We just have to stop pretending the question is ridiculous. Because the Great Pyramid isn't silent. It hums, not loudly, not obviously, but just enough to remind us that it may have been built to do something. And whatever that something was, it didn't end when the last stone was set in place. At this point, the question shifts again. Not what the Great Pyramid was, but why we're so determined to call it a tomb. Because names matter. They shape how far our curiosity is allowed to go. A tomb is familiar, comforting, even. It fits neatly into what we expect ancient people to do. They bury their dead. They honor the afterlife. They build monuments to mortality. A machine from the deep past? That doesn't sit well. It suggests capability where we're used to seeing limitation. Intent where we prefer symbolism. Purpose we don't understand. Calling it a tomb makes it safe. Calling it a machine makes it unsettling. So perhaps the label tells us more about us than about the pyramid. Now consider this possibility, quietly. What if later Egyptians didn't fully understand what the Great Pyramid was either? What if they inherited it? Cultures reuse things all the time. They reinterpret them. They ritualize what they no longer know how to operate. Think of how we treat old cathedrals today. Many were built for intense, immersive ritual. Now they're museums, concert halls, tourist sites. The structure remains. The original function fades, meaning fills the gap. What if something similar happened at Giza? The pyramid was already there, or at least already conceived. When later dynasties arrived, they didn't build it from scratch in the way we imagine. They maintained it, respected it, integrated it into their worldview, and eventually, when its original purpose was lost, they called it a tomb. Not because they were lying, but because it was the closest concept they had. This idea shouldn't feel radical. We've seen it before. In Sumer, the people said knowledge was given. They didn't claim to invent civilization. They inherited systems and built their society around them. In Sangsingdui, there was no explanation at all, just faces. Memory preserved visually because words weren't trusted to survive. Giza feels like the next step in that pattern. Not the story, not the explanation, the tool. Something left behind. Something that once did something important enough to justify enormous effort, precision, and material. And when that something stopped, or when no one knew how to use it anymore, the structure remained. People don't dismantle sacred things. They reinterpret them. They wrap them in meaning. They protect them with myth. A machine becomes a monument. A function becomes a symbol. A system becomes a story about death. That doesn't mean the Egyptians were mistaken or naive. It means they were human. They inherited a structure that mattered. They honored it the best way they knew how. And centuries later, we inherited the story they told, without ever questioning whether it was the first story told about that place. So when we ask, why call it a tomb at all? The answer might be surprisingly simple. Because calling it a tomb closes the question. Calling it a machine opens one we're not ready to answer. One that connects back to everything we've seen so far. Knowledge that appears suddenly. Cultures that reorganize around it. Artifacts left behind without instructions. Sumer had the story. Sengsengdui had the faces. Giza may have had the tool. And if that's even partially true, then the most unsettling thought isn't that ancient people built something extraordinary. It's that they may have been maintaining something they didn't create. Which brings us to the final turn of this chapter. Because once you allow for that possibility, the Great Pyramid stops being a mystery of death and starts being a question about inheritance. Why this changes everything. Let's make this simple again. Imagine you're walking through the desert and you find a phone. You don't know what electricity is. You don't know what networks are. You don't know what screens do. The object is smooth, precise, clearly intentional. So you do the only thing that makes sense. You call it a magic mirror. You build stories around it, you give it meaning. You protect it, you pass it down. And centuries later, people argue endlessly about what the mirror symbolized. Was it about self-reflection? The soul, the afterlife? All the while, the phone still turns on. That's the Great Pyramid. Maybe the pyramid isn't mysterious because it's old. Maybe it's mysterious because it still hasn't finished saying what it was built to do. We've spent generations debating its symbolism while quietly ignoring its behavior. We've argued over tomb theories while the structure itself keeps insisting, through geometry, resonance, and material choice, that it was built to interact with the world. Not to hold a body, not to tell a story, but to do something. And here's the part that lingers once you strip everything else away. If the Great Pyramid really is a device of some kind, whether for energy, alignment, communication, or something we don't yet have words for, then it changes how we see the ancient world. Not as primitive, not as mystical, but as inheritors. Inheritors of knowledge that didn't start with them. Caretakers of systems they respected, but may not have fully understood. Whether the Great Pyramid was a power plant, a signal, or something we don't yet have language for, it leaves us with an uncomfortable realization. The most famous structure on Earth might not be a monument to death at all. It might be evidence that once, someone understood the planet better than we do now.